300 people. A packed wedding hall. Flowers on every table. Champagne glasses catching the light. A band playing something slow and beautiful in the corner. And me, standing at the microphone, shaking, with tears streaming down my face, holding a folded piece of paper that I had never intended to read out loud. Not in front of all those people. Not like this. But she had pushed me too far. And what happened next? What I said into that microphone silenced the entire room. Some people cried. Some gasped. 2 people walked out. And my son, my own son, looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the very first time in his 34 years of life. I never wanted it to come to this. I want you to understand that before we go any further. I am not a dramatic woman. I am not someone who makes scenes. I raised my boy on my own, worked 2 jobs for most of his childhood, and spent my whole life being the kind of person who swallowed her feelings to keep the peace. But there are moments in life when you can only be pushed so far. And that night at my son Marcus's wedding, I finally reached mine. Before we go any further into this story, if you've ever been disrespected by family, if you've ever stayed quiet for too long and regretted it, or if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, I think you're going to want to stay until the very end of this one. This story goes places I genuinely did not expect it to go when I first started living it. And if you're new here, welcome to Hidden Truth Stories, the place where real people share the moments that changed everything. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, so more stories like this can reach the people who need them. Now, let's go back to where this all truly started, because the wedding was not the beginning, not even close. My name is Patricia. I am 61 years old. I live in a mid-sized city in Ohio, and I have one son, Marcus. I raised him alone from the time he was 7 years old, after his father left us with very little money. A mountain of debt I didn't even know we had, and a note on the kitchen counter that said he needed to find himself. I never badmouthed his father to Marcus. I made a decision early on that whatever I thought of the man, Marcus deserved to form his own relationship with him. That decision cost me more emotionally than I can put into words, because his father, Gerald, came back into Marcus's life when Marcus was about 16. Right around the time I had finally gotten a stable, new apartment, decent job at the school district, Marcus doing well in school. Gerald walked back in like he'd just been on a long vacation, and Marcus, who had spent 9 years watching me struggle, opened his arms to him completely. I didn't fight it. I told myself it was healthy. I told myself a boy needs his father. What I didn't anticipate was that Gerald would slowly, quietly, begin poisoning the well. Not dramatically. Not with outright lies. At least, not at first. But with little comments here and there. Things like, "Your mom always was a bit controlling, wasn't she? Or she means well, but she never really trusted you to make your own decisions." Small seeds, planted carefully, over years. I only found out much later exactly what Gerald had been saying, and by then the roots had grown deep. Marcus met Diane when he was 28. She was 30, sharp as a tack, ambitious, and extraordinarily beautiful. I genuinely liked her when I first met her. She had this energy about her, confident, direct, funny when she wanted to be. We had a lovely dinner, the 3 of us, and I drove home that night feeling genuinely hopeful. I thought, this is a good woman for my son. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. I did not dislike Diane. Not in the beginning. What changed things was gradual. It was a series of small moments that I kept explaining away, kept giving the benefit of the doubt, because I loved my son and I wanted his relationship to work. The first thing I noticed was how she spoke about my home. Marcus and I had a tradition. Every Sunday, if he wasn't working, he'd come over for dinner. We'd been doing it since he moved out at 22. It was just our thing. About 4 months after he and Diane got serious, she came along one Sunday, and I had cooked a full meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from scratch. So Waltine looked around my apartment and said, not quietly, not as a private aside, she said, "It's very cozy in here, isn't it?" Very lived in. And then she smiled at Marcus in that way that couples do when they have a private language. I let it go. I told myself she was nervous. I served her 2 helpings of everything and sent her home with leftovers. The second thing was at Christmas. The first Christmas she was part of our family gathering. I had my sister Linda there, her husband, their 2 kids, and Marcus, a small, warm gathering. I had made a photo collage, something I'd been doing every year for about a decade. Framed pictures of the year's memories, Marcus at different moments. Diane looked at it and said, in front of everyone, "Oh, Marcus, your mother really does keep you close, doesn't she? That's so sweet." The word sweet had a sharp edge to it that only women tend to notice. My sister Linda caught my eye from across the room. I smiled and changed the subject. I let it go again. That was my pattern. Let it go. Keep the peace. Don't be the problem. The engagement happened after they'd been together about 3 years. Marcus called me, excited, voice full of joy, and I cried happy tears. Whatever complications existed with Diane, my son was happy. That was enough for me. I told him I'd do whatever I could to help with the wedding. I meant it. Completely. Over the next 6 months, I offered to help with catering research. I offered to contribute financially. I had been saving a small amount every month since. Marcus was born in an account I thought of as his future fund, and I offered to help with whatever Diane needed in terms of preparation. Most of my offers were politely declined. Not rudely. Just redirected. We've got it handled, Patricia. Diane has a very specific vision. We'll let you know if we need anything. The vision, as it turned out, involved Gerald quite heavily. My son's father, the man who left us, had apparently been rehabilitated in Diane's eyes into a charming, funny, generous figure. He was invited to every planning dinner. His new wife, a woman named Sherry, who is roughly my son's age, was part of the wedding party. I was not asked to be involved in any official capacity. I told myself this was fine. What mattered was being there. What mattered was seeing my son get married. 3 weeks before the wedding, I received a call from the venue coordinator. She was calling to confirm the table arrangements, and in the process of that conversation, she mentioned something that stopped my heart. She said, "And just to confirm, you're comfortable with your seating at table 14. I asked her to repeat herself. Table 14. I pulled up the seating chart she emailed over, and there it was. Table 14. In the back corner of the hall, near the kitchen entrance, while Gerald and Sherry were at table to right next to the wedding party. I sat with my sister Linda and her husband, 2 cousins I hadn't seen in years, and 2 people I didn't recognize at all. Table 14. I had raised this boy alone. I had worked double shifts at the school district to pay for his sports gear, his school trips, his first car. Table 14. I called Marcus. He didn't answer. I texted him, kept it calm, just said I'd love to chat when he had a moment. He called back 2 days later and explained, in a voice that sounded rehearsed, that the seating had been very complicated and that Diane had done her best to accommodate everyone. He said Diane's family is very large and it wasn't meant as any kind of statement. I told him I understood. I told him I loved him. I let it go. Are you sensing a pattern? The week before the wedding, I found out not from Marcus, but from my cousin, who had been talking to someone in Gerald's circle, that at the rehearsal dinner, which I had not been invited to, Diane had made a toast. In that toast, she had thanked everyone who had truly been there for Marcus. She had specifically named Gerald. She had specifically named Gerald's wife, Sherry. She had said, and I am quoting what was reported back to me, to the people who showed up, who built Marcus into the man he is today. We see you, and we love you. The people who showed up. That was the phrase. I, the woman who never left, was being erased by the woman who came back, and Diane was helping draw the curtain. I went to that wedding. I wore a deep green dress. I had bought specifically because Marcus once told me green was his favorite color on me. I sat at table 14. I smiled at everyone I was seated with. I ate my meal and I kept my composure, and I watched my son dance with his new wife, and I felt a complicated cocktail of pride and grief that I think only mothers understand. I had almost made it through. Almost. The speeches started around 9 in the evening. Gerald went first. His speech was polished, too polished, like he'd had it professionally written, and it painted this warm, generous portrait of a father who had been a steady presence in Marcus's life. There was laughter. There were tears. There was applause. Gerald sat down, looking like a man who had just won something. Then the best man spoke. Then Diane's sister. Then Diane's father. Beautiful speeches. All of them. And then Diane stood up. And she took the microphone, and she said she wanted to add one last personal thank you before the night got too late. What followed was 7 minutes. I counted later. Watching it on video. 7 minutes of Diane talking about the people who had shaped Marcus. More thanks to Gerald. Thanks to Sherry. Thanks to her own parents, her siblings, her college roommate, who would become Marcus's close friend. And then she paused. She looked directly at the table where I was sitting, in the back corner of the room, and she said into the microphone, in front of 300 people. And of course, Marcus's mother, Patricia, is here. Patricia, we see you back there. Always in the background, aren't you? That's just your way. And then she laughed a light, breezy little laugh, and moved on to thanking the venue staff. Always in the background. In front of 300 people, at my son's wedding. The table went quiet. My sister Linda reached across and grabbed my hand. I could feel my face burning. I could hear the blood in my ears. And I looked at Marcus, my reason for everything. And he was looking down at the table, not at me, down at the table. And in that moment I understood something I had been refusing to understand for years. This had been building. This had been allowed to build. And silence was no longer an option. I had that piece of paper in my purse because I had written a speech, a small one. Modesta had planned to ask if I might say a few words at some point in the evening. Not a formal speech, just a brief, heartfelt toast to my son. I had written it weeks earlier, edited it a dozen times, made it warm and gracious, and entirely focused on Marcus's happiness. That was the speech I had intended to give. That is not the speech I gave. I stood up, and I walked to the front of the room, and someone, to this day I don't know who, handed me the microphone when I reached the small stage area. The room went a little quiet, curious. I could see Diane's face, which had gone from a polite smile to something more careful, more watchful. I could see Gerald, who looked mildly amused, and I could see Marcus, who had looked up from the table and was now watching me with an expression I had never seen on him before, something between fear and recognition. I did not unfold the paper. I left it in my hand and I spoke from memory, from the place where all the things I had swallowed for 30 years were stored. I told that room about the night Marcus was 7 years old and his father left, and how Marcus had climbed into my bed at 2 in the morning and asked me if it was his fault, and how I had held him for 3 hours and told him over and over that he was the best thing that had ever happened to me, and that nothing that had happened was about him. I told them about working the breakfast shift at the diner and the afternoon shift at the school before I finally got the full-time position that let me stop the double shifts. I told them about saving birthday money to buy Marcus's first real basketball, because he'd been practicing with a half-deflated one for a year and hadn't told me because he knew we were tight. I told them about driving 4 hours each way to watch him play in a tournament, sleeping in the car to save the hotel money, and him not knowing until he was in his 20s that I had done that. And then I paused, and I looked at Diane, and I said calmly, without heat, without drama, I was never in the background of my son's life. I was the ground he stood on. I want to wish Marcus and Diane every happiness, but I also want my son to hear, clearly, in front of everyone who loves him, that he is loved by his mother more than he will ever fully understand. And I genuinely hope, that one day he will make sure the people who build him up are treated accordingly. Congratulations, Marcus. I'll always be proud of you. And I set the microphone down, and I walked back to table 14, and the room was completely, utterly silent for what felt like an entire minute. Then my sister Linda started clapping, then one of the cousins. Then a few people I didn't know, then more. It wasn't a roar. It was something quieter and more serious than that. It was the sound of 300 people recalibrating what they'd just witnessed. I saw 2 of Diane's aunts dab in their eyes. I saw the venue coordinator in the doorway with her hand over her mouth. I saw Gerald, who was not clapping, staring at his drink. And I saw Diane, who had gone very still, and whose new husband, my son, had reached across and taken her hand in a way that looked less like affection and more like steadying. What happened after, in the days and weeks that followed, was complicated in the way that real life is always more complicated than the dramatic moment that precedes it. Marcus called me the following morning. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Mom, I owe you an apology." It was not a perfect conversation. It was not a neat resolution. He is still married to Diane. I am still his mother. Some wounds do not close overnight, but something shifted that night. Something that needed shifting for a long time. What I've come to understand is this. There is a particular kind of invisibility that falls on women like me. Women who do the quiet, relentless work of holding things together, who sacrifice without announcement because there is no time for announcement, who love without performance because love was never meant to be performed. It was meant to be lived. And because we do not demand recognition, people around us begin to assume we do not need it. They begin to take the ground for granted. They forget that ground was not always there, that someone put it there and keeps it there through sheer, determined love. I do not tell this story to make Diane a villain. She is a young woman who came into a complicated family dynamic and made choices she will have to reckon with in her own time. I do not tell this story to embarrass my son, whom I love without conditions and always will. I tell this story because I know there are women and men watching this right now who have been placed at table 14 in their own lives, who have been called always in the background by someone who has never stopped to consider what the background is made of, who have swallowed enough to fill an ocean and have started to wonder if speaking up would cost them more than staying silent already has. Here is what I learned that night, standing at a microphone in a green dress at the back of a wedding hall in Ohio. Your story matters. The quiet years matter. The car you slept in, the overtime shift, the 3 hours holding a 7-year-old in the dark. Those things happened, and they are real, and they deserve to be spoken. You do not have to be loud to be seen, but you do have to be willing to speak when the moment arrives. I had swallowed my voice for years in the name of keeping the peace, and all that swallowing had not kept the peace at all. It had only kept me quiet. If I could go back, would I change anything? I've thought about this a great deal. I would not change the speech. I would change the years of silence that made it necessary. I would have spoken more calmly, more directly, more often in private conversations before things calcified into something that could only be resolved in front of 300 people. I would have talked to Marcus about what I was observing long before a wedding toast forced the issue into the open. Silence is not peace. Silence is just postponed pain. As for where things stand now, Marcus and I speak regularly. It is careful, and it is honest in a way it was not before. Diane and I are not close. I do not think we will be, and I have made my peace with that. But there is a respect in our interactions that was absent before, something that was established. I think the moment I set down that microphone and walked back to my table without waiting to see how the room responded. Some things can only be earned, and some things can only be said once, clearly, so that they cannot be unsaid. I want to thank every single one of you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life, your mother, your grandmother, someone who built the ground you stand on, please share this video with them. Let them hear that they are seen. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been placed at the metaphorical table 14? Have you ever been the one doing the placing, looking back now with different eyes? This community is built on honesty, and your stories matter here. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about the moments that change us, the silences we break, and the truths that set things right, even when they cannot set things back. Until next time, take care of the people who built your ground. And if you are someone's ground, know that what you do is seen, even when the room goes quiet.